welcome to Advanced Mate. So today's video is about the Eurocentric worldview. I wanted also to compare it to other worldviews in some perspectives, like how they might differ, but mostly to talk about the different ways the Eurocentric worldview, of course, affects the rest of the world, especially when we're talking about globalization. And globalization of what? Because what are we globalizing? Obviously, we would have to establish what is a worldview. Now, a worldview is the way we see the world. It's the way we make sense of our surroundings. It's the way we make sense of the questions that humans have, our values, what are our priorities. It's basically the way we manage our surroundings and our world. Now, obviously, different cultures and different places in the world and races and so on have had different ways of seeing the world. They have had different myths that made sense of their surroundings, their history, the universe. They had ways of telling stories about their world that painted their framework, which meant their worldview of the world. So the Eurocentric worldview is quite interesting, especially when connecting it to my series of decolonization, because obviously when I talk about decolonization, I always have to understand what am I decolonizing myself from. Like most parts of Africa, my country was colonized by Europeans. And in that sense, their worldview came with them in colonizing our country and our continent. Mentioned in another video, this book for me has been very important in my decolonization journey, and I really hope that you guys got a chance to check it out, or even the PDF of this book. Especially as formerly colonized people, there's a lot of things we now have to make sense of. So let's start. In the Eurocentric worldview, time in a way is seen in a more linear way, which has a beginning and obviously an end. Whereas in a lot of different worldviews, indigenous ways of seeing the world, you have the world seen more in a holistic way. Everything is connected in that sense. And I think this is already a great departure of talking about the Eurocentric worldview, because it is about the separation of both time, but also other things in the way we understand spirituality, in the way we understand science, in the way we understand nature, body, the mind, and the soul. Animals, humans. It's about differentiating and looking for difference, and not only looking for difference in the sense of just understanding difference, but it seeks to create hierarchies within those differences. So if you see animals and man, you place man at the top. These differences in the hierarchies are created based on what can dominate what the most. So it's also about domination, it's about violence in that sense, that if something is bigger than you, if something is stronger than you, then obviously it is at the top. Cue Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Now, I'm not saying that obviously that there are no dominance or violence in other worldviews. Of course, these are also parts that might come in different worldviews. It's also interesting to note that this difference-seeking way of seeing the world is also part of why things are not separated to again be boxed in just for the sake of that, but to create, like I said, a hierarchy. But also this is a conflict-seeking worldview, in the sense that whatever we seek to make difference, we have to determine what is superior and what is inferior about it in order to create a hierarchy, right? So that means, for example, you have hierarchies in the sexes, gender, in race, in animals, and so on. And we measure everything based on our perspective, because our perspective is seen as universal. Our understanding of the way is seen as universal for the rest of the world. What we believe in, whether it's secularism or religion, is seen as universal. Western civilization or the European-centric worldview is seen as synonymous to what is most advanced, what is again superior. And because it is superior, and because it is at the top of it, everything at the bottom should be dominated by it. But not only dominated, in some degrees it takes the form of, like the saying, the white man's burden, in that because they are so advanced and evolved, they have the burden of civilizing the rest of the world, whether it was during the crusade, bringing Christianity to the rest of the world, or colonizing the rest of the world to bring civilization and order to the rest of the world. The big burden of basically taming the rest of the world that is seen as savage, and it's their duty to make sure that all this savagery, for their own good, lives up to the ideals and values that are held in the Eurocentric perspective. What I believe in is that we all have different worldviews, and that is totally understandable and that is totally respectable, because we all see the world differently. Even person to person, we have people that are more optimistic, people that are more pessimistic, people that are more, see themselves as being moved more by rationality or by emotions or both, or so on. And on a person to person, we understand that people do things differently. But when you say that there's one superior way of being, then you have the unfortunate burden of convincing everyone that they're wrong and you're right. And so it begins, all the conflicts that then are persuaded from this, and the idea of, because difference is bad, in order for us to achieve peace, we have to all be alike. We have to believe in the same thing. We have to value the same things. We have to talk the same way, shop the same way, eat the same way, and so on. It's a way to homogenize the world, because differences are seen as bad. I feel like this is also where the saying, for example, I am colorblind, I see all people as equal. Instead of saying I see color and I see all people as equally deserving of their humanity. Because equal to what, in that sense? Again, we are centering it around the Eurocentric perspective. Equal to me, right? It's also the same with sexism. You could say that, okay, I see all women as equal. Equal to what? Equal to me as a man. Or we want to be equal to who? Equal to men. Not, again, admitting that in their own right, in their own view, in their own values, they themselves are powerful enough to be human, to have their humanity, and to decide for themselves what they ought to be, regardless of a comparison to man or white people or so on. So the Eurocentric worldview, in that sense, sets otherness against itself always. There is the European or the Western man, or the Western way of living, and then there's everything else. When we talk about globalization, obviously, this is also something that we have to be aware of. Because when we have one dominant worldview, which ironically comes from a group that is the least amount of people on the earth, I keep repeating this because it's something that I also realized just recently. Like, that makes no sense. How does a small minority of people get to decide what happens on the greater surface of the world, and all the ways people live and the way they want to rule their own lives? And when we talk about also nature and man, this is also interesting to talk about, because in the Eurocentric worldview, man is on top of everything else. Therefore, man has the right and entitlement to do with the earth as he pleases, to nature as he pleases, whereas you have many other worldviews that know that we are a part of nature. What we do to nature, we do to ourselves. So when you see the cases like the Dakota pipeline, and you see how the Native Americans are fighting for water, not just for them, but for the rest of the world, they're saying water is life. They're not saying water is life for the Native Americans. They believe that water is life for everybody. It is quite interesting that this in any way should be seen as a fight of the Native Americans, because we all drink water. So it's again this way of distancing oneself from one's environment, and thinking, because I can dominate nature, because I can create all these things, all these tools, because I do not need to respect nature, because I can dominate it. Respect is basically of who can dominate who has the most amount of violence or can threaten with the most amount of violence. Now, Ubuntu, and I'm not trying to paint, oh my God, everything we do is so much better. No, because what this is about is basically saying there are more ways of seeing the world than one. When you have Ubuntu, for example, we believe that I am because we all are. It's quite similar to what the Aboriginal Australians have. It's quite similar to the Native Americans have. And also this idea of twinness, which is about unification instead of separating. Twinness is kind of like the East philosophy of yin and yang, whereas that things that are different are not so they can oppose each other, but they're there so they can balance each other. So when we see difference, it's to create harmony, it's to create unification. Twinness is an African philosophy, but it also believes that, okay, what is the balancing of the man and the woman, the feminine and the masculine? of nature and man, of everything, moon and the sun, everything is working together to create harmony. So this is quite interesting when you say it again in the Eurocentric worldview. Nature is seen as against man, not for man. The other worldviews see nature as with man and a part of man. This also you can relate to what happens after colonialism in many countries. For example, I was studying when it came down there and it saw the relationship that the natives had with nature and their surrounding. It saw this as demonic, and therefore because they were having a relationship with nature and man was supposed to be on top of nature and worship only God, they were doing something that was not encouraged, and it was encouraged for them to leave these demonic and primitive ways of living and instead get the civilized man's religion, which was Christianity, in which nature is of course to be dominated and used for the good of man and not really understood or worshipped or taken care of. But from an environmental perspective, which is quite interesting, these ways of doing things actually maintained their ecosystem because they knew that their ecosystem was holy for them. They thought, environment feeds us, we take care of it, and it takes care of us, which is quite interesting because now we are talking about global warming, we are talking about the destruction of the earth, and not really actually talking about which worldview or philosophies or ways of seeing the world has contributed to this destruction. Because in many other worldviews, they saw whatever they did as correlations to what they were doing to themselves. We do not really have that in the Eurocentric worldview. Anyway, there's so much more about this. I've been studying about the Eurocentric worldview, and I find it so interesting because it does explain a lot of things that our planet does suffer from in a lot of ways that indigenous people or formerly colonized people suffer today. So all of these things obviously do matter, and they affect the way we manage the world on a global scale because it matters where our values and our worldviews come from, because they dictate what we see as reasonable and what we see as unreasonable. And that obviously is different to all beings and all cultures and all worldviews. A world that has to respect that not everybody is going to see or value what you value, it's harder to manage and therefore dominate on a bigger scale when everybody thinks differently. Nature works because of diversity. You have plant eaters, you have carnivores, you have animals and beings that live on the earth, in the sky, and some trees, and in the sea. All of these things are important. They're what makes the world holistically healthy, and they're what make it thrive on a holistic level. When we don't have that holistic perspective, we are forced to think that things can be put against each other instead of put together to work for each other. I just wanted to share that with you, to be aware of those ways of thinking in the dominating worldview, and why do you feel like your way is the only way and it's the only right way to do things. And I'll see you in my next video, guys. Bye!
Turn the lights down low and pull down your window curtain. Oh, let your moon come shining into our life again.